I'm Atra El-Nashar at the White House. Iran and Russia announcing joint naval drills in the Middle East. The move inflaming tensions between the U.S. and Iran, which are already preparing for potential military conflict if nuclear negotiations break down. 24 hours after a second round of indirect nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran, more signs each country is preparing for military action. Axios reports the Trump administration is closer to a major war in the Middle East than most Americans realize. It could begin very soon.
There's many reasons and arguments that one could make for a strike against Iran.
In this now deleted post by Iranian state media, an image of rows and rows of empty graves with this provocative but unconfirmed message. 5,000 graves have been prepared for U.S. soldiers in case a war breaks out. Top American and Iranian leaders openly speculating about war.
I think the president has a lot of options. We do have a very powerful military. The president's shown a willingness to use it.
The strongest military force in the world may at times be struck so hard that it cannot get up again.
If diplomacy fails, what would a military confrontation look like? Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a close ally of President Trump, is bullish on using force to enact regime change in Iran.
They have a lot of ballistic missiles. They could hurt us. It could do damage to Israel, but every day that goes by in the war, they get less capable. We don't need boots on the ground in Iran. We need to partner with Israel if we do a military operation to make sure we get the highest and best benefit of our capabilities.
Iran could get some help from Russia, which uses Iranian drones in its invasion of Ukraine. Wednesday, Russian naval forces arriving in Iran for joint exercises in the Gulf of Oman. The White House is not publicly committing to a deadline for when diplomatic talks with Iran need to yield an actual nuclear deal, but President Trump has said he wants to see things move quickly. We're also learning the president is in active talks with his national security team as he makes this decision about whether to strike Iran. At the White House, I'm Atra El-Nashar.
Angela, thank you. Developing this morning, the Trump administration preparing for another round of nuclear talks with Iran in the next 2 weeks. President Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, did meet with Iranian officials in Geneva Tuesday, with one White House official saying there was progress, but major gaps do remain. Iran is signaling it will not agree to fully dismantle its nuclear program. The U.S., though, has made it clear that is the end goal.
If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, there are a lot of other regimes, some friendly, some not so friendly, who would get nuclear weapons after them. That would be a disaster for the American people, because then you have these crazy regimes all over the world with the most dangerous weapons in the world. And that's one of the things the president has said he's going to prevent.
In the weeks leading up to Tuesday's meeting, tensions have been mounting, raising fears of military action if talks do fail. The U.S. has deployed hundreds of aircraft and additional naval forces to that region. Also yesterday, Iran conducted military drills in the Strait of Hormuz, temporarily closing one of the world's most critical supply routes. Right now, the White House monitoring Iran's military drills happening in the Middle East as tensions over a nuclear agreement come near a breaking point. As we come on the air, both the Pentagon and Iran are building up military assets. Over the past 48 hours, reports show the U.S. military has sent 150 military cargo flights and another 50 fighter jets to that region. President Trump also holding meetings with advisors on a possible strike that reports show could happen, if necessary, as early as this weekend.
The president has always been very clear, though, with respect to Iran or any country around the world. Diplomacy is always his first option, and Iran would be very wise to make a deal with President Trump and with this administration.
Mark Boyle joining us again from the live desk with the latest on this situation. And Mark, really a tense situation playing out at this hour.
That's right, Jan. We are hearing that the president really wants all of his cabinet members dialed in at this point this morning. And according to a new report from Axios, the U.S. could be looking at the possibility of a weeks-long campaign against Iran. The report noting here, Israel would be joining the United States in the military campaign if it were to happen. Keeping in mind, the United States and Israel launched multiple aerial attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities 1 year ago. In the past few days, the United States has gathered a lot of its military strength in the waters close to the Middle East. The locations that we're talking about on this map here behind me, multiple aircraft carriers, destroyers arriving in the area. All of this as the buildup towards what could be a possible war. Could be avoided, though, if the United States is able to strike a new deal with the nuclear conversations with Iran. There's new evidence now Iran is fortifying its defenses. There's new satellite images out right now. They've barricaded essentially the entrances, the in and out points of these nuclear facilities, including sites that were hit last year during the U.S. operation dubbed Midnight Hammer. Iran also buried those entrances around other nuclear sites too. So it's not just one or two, it's several. And we'll monitor that for you as updates come in and reaction out of the Middle East. We'll see what happens. But these attacks that we're hearing could happen as early as this weekend, Jen.
Mark, thank you. This morning, the Iranian regime also on the clock, facing a deadline to present a proposal to resolve the differences of a possible nuclear agreement. Both sides are still far apart on a deal, especially when it comes to Iran's missile stockpile.
I'm Atra El-Nashar in Washington. President Trump says within the next 10 days, he plans to make a decision about whether to continue nuclear negotiations with Iran or take military action. U.S. military forces in the Middle East standing by for potential orders to attack Iran, possibly as soon as this weekend, in what would be Trump's second round of strikes in less than a year.
Now we may have to take it a step further, or we may not. Maybe we're going to make a deal. You're going to be finding out over the next probably 10 days.
That 10-day timeline the president outlining Thursday may not play out because President Trump said this just one day before ordering strikes on Iran in Operation Midnight Hammer last June.
I'm giving him a period of time, and I would say 2 weeks would be the maximum.
The very next day, the president told the nation U.S. forces bombed 3 Iranian nuclear facilities.
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
Since a second round of indirect nuclear talks with Iran in Geneva this week, signs of looming conflict have only intensified.
We have to make a meaningful deal. Otherwise, bad things happen.
Satellite images show what President Trump calls an armada of U.S. forces stationed near Iran. The blue squares represent naval assets, including destroyers and an aircraft carrier. A second is on the way. And the red dots show bases with attack planes and other air power.
The type of kinetic action that the U.S. would wage would be primarily an air campaign. Decapacitation strikes and regime change and collapse, those two would involve prolonged, intense air campaigns.
This isn't just between the U.S. and Iran. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to travel to Israel next week to update Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the situation. And Russia showing support for Iran, running joint naval exercises in the Gulf of Oman Thursday. Here's Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
No one wants the new escalations. Everyone understands that this is playing with fire.
U.S. forces and the American public watching and waiting to learn what the commander-in-chief decides. In Washington, I'm Atra El-Nashar reporting.
Developing as we come on the air, the War Department positioning more military assets in the Middle East right now as Iran faces a deadline to reach a deal. President Trump says Iran has less than 2 weeks as he considers options on possible military action. And thanks for joining us. I'm Jan Jeffcoat. It is Friday, February 20th, and this morning, the Iranian regime is on the clock and completely surrounded by the largest deployment of U.S. forces in decades. We want to get right to Angela Brown at the live desk, who is tracking all the latest developments. Good morning to you, Angela. You know, a lot happening right now, and Trump says Iran is running out of time.
Yeah, what do we have, like 10 days before something has to happen?
That's right.
Happen leading up to what? I guess that's the big question. What are we counting down to? Well, the president is weighing a ton of options right now. And we haven't seen, as Jan mentioned, military buildup like this in the Middle East in more than 20 years. We're talking on the Iraq War. Now, right now, the president could go really a number of directions at this point, including targeted strikes on Iran's nuclear and military bases, taking out Iran's leaders, or trying to let peace kind of prevail in the situation. Speaking to the newly formed Board of Peace in the past 24 hours, the president says he's going to make that decision in the next week or so.
And we do have some work to do with Iran. They can't have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. You can't have peace in the Middle East if they have a nuclear weapon. And they can't have a nuclear weapon. And they've been told that very strongly.
Well, Trump has hinted for a regime change on one end and has insisted Iran not obtain that nuclear weapons that he mentioned right there. Now, leaders in Europe are starting to feel how real this could actually be. The Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, warned his citizens in Iran to immediately evacuate that nation. He added flights out of the country might not be available in the next several hours. Now, I want you to take a look at this map right here behind me as well. I want you to focus on this right here. It shows the buildup of U.S. military forces and what have have been stationed close to Iran. The U.S. is still trying to bring even more warships and aircraft carriers into the region at this hour. A lot developing in the Middle East this morning. We're going to stay on top of all this this morning at the live desk.
All right, Angela, thanks so much. Also this morning, the White House monitoring Iran's efforts to rebuild the nuclear sites the U.S. destroyed in Operation Midnight Hammer over the summer. A watchdog group said Iran does appear to have accelerated restoration and redevelopment operations of uranium enrichment despite these nuclear talks. Satellite images released earlier this week also showed reconstruction activity underway at these sites. Meantime, back in Washington, there is growing bipartisan support to use military force if Iran fails to reach a nuclear deal with the U.S. Pennsylvania Democratic Senator John Fetterman said he supports President Trump's strategy.
If they have 900 pounds of near weapons grade uranium, why wouldn't you strike that? Why wouldn't you hold them accountable that way? And now here we are again, and now we've demonstrated that's the only thing Iran ever responds to is strength and power and hit them. And if they want to hit them again, because I don't think you can't really trust and negotiate with them. You can't negotiate with cancer. You have to attack it and go right at it with superior force.
Nuclear talks with Iran continuing, as well as a strategic military buildup in the Middle East. The U.S. has deployed multiple carrier strike groups while Tehran does conduct live fire missile drills in the Strait of Hormuz. Joining us now to break it all down, retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General John Teichert. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Jan. Thanks for having me.
As we know, the Iranian regime on the clock right now, but they are completely surrounded by the largest deployment of U.S. forces in decades. What's your thoughts right now? Are we going to war?
Jan, I think that the president is assembling the right set of capabilities, both offensively and defensively, so that he has the options. And the first option would be use that armada to force Iran to make a deal. But secondly, if the opportunity avails itself, it could be as early as tonight, then use that massive capability that is still being built up to strike to achieve his objectives. I don't think the president has made a decision. I think that window of negotiations is closing, and I think Iran would be wise to make a deal. Otherwise, they're going to face the full force of the United States military.
Well, diplomacy is always the first option. Nobody wants to go to war, but intelligence does show they are advancing toward rebuilding those nuclear sites even as these talks continue. At what point does the U.S. say talk is cheap?
Well, I think, Jan, we realize because Iran has never negotiated in good faith that talk is cheap, especially in coming from them, which leads me to believe that if Iran ever decides to make a deal, then it must be accompanied by two things. Number one, robust verification so they're not lying and cheating. And number two, major irreversible steps that would degrade their nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and their proxies before we give them sanctions relief, so that they can't just say they're doing something, get the benefit of a deal, and then not do it. We need verification, and we need irreversible steps before sanction relief.
Yeah, we just heard Democratic Senator John Fetterman say, you don't negotiate with the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. There is no talking at that point. So what would an armed conflict, though, with Iran look like? Would it be boots on the ground? Would it end once perhaps there was a regime change? What does that look like?
Jan, when you're completing or building a military campaign, you always start with objectives. And because we're not 100% sure from the president whether this is just about the nuclear program or the nuclear program and ballistic missiles or proxies or support to the protesters, we don't quite know. But I hope in that situation room, he is defining the objectives. And then you can build a campaign with the right assets and the right sustainability and the right risk woven in. I don't imagine any of it would involve U.S. boots on the ground, but I could see up to the high end of conflict a large sustained air campaign against a variety of targets, including regime targets in Iran. But again, I don't see boots on the ground, but also it all starts with objectives. And I hope the president is conveying clearly those objectives to his military planners.
Given Iran's enrichment history and previous U.S. strikes on its facilities, how close do you believe Iran is to a viable nuclear weapon? And what will it take to prevent that outcome from dragging America into another prolonged conflict?
Jan, the source on this topic that I trust the most is the Institute for Science and International Security. They are experts in this area. They are nonpartisan, and they said back in June that Iran's nuclear program, $500 billion worth, was effectively destroyed by Operation Midnight Hammer, turned to rubble. And I do want to warn your listeners and viewers that just because we see some superficial activity on top of these sites doesn't mean they're able to recover the enriched uranium underneath. It doesn't mean that those centrifuges are operational. And I still think that their capability is effectively destroyed. And I do know that the president would have real intelligence, far more than just what's going on the surface, about how close they likely are to nuclear capability.
How long does it take to enrich uranium and to rebuild what was destroyed?
Well, I think, Jan, the reason that institute gave us the comments about effectively being destroyed is that the centrifuges were destroyed. The enriched uranium was largely destroyed. The know-how, the scientists were likely killed or destroyed. And so all of the parts of the chain of capability to produce a nuclear weapon, according to that institute, were destroyed such that there was no viable short-term path to create nuclear capability. Certainly the United States does not desire, nor does the world, to Iran to ever approach nuclear capability. But I still think they're a long ways away underground from having the capability and all of those components lining up to give them that capability.
Yeah, but like you said, you just don't know. You just don't know. How likely is it that Israel acts independently, and what would that mean for U.S. involvement?
Jan, the Prime Minister was here in the United States last week. No doubt he talked to the President of the United States about a variety of options. That includes the likelihood of negotiations working. That includes U.S.-only strikes. That includes U.S. and Israel strikes combined. And I think just like back in June, the only way that Israel would strike without the United States is if somehow the president gave Netanyahu the green light to do so. But I think because we're so inclined to be prepared to strike as the United States, that I don't see Israel going it alone, but I do see the United States and Israel undertaking this sustained air campaign against Iran when the time comes, doing it together.
All right, retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General John Teichert. Always great to get your expertise on this. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Have a great weekend.
You too, Jan. Thank you.